Today, we will talk about the South Ossetia Conflict of 2008. This is the story of how one night of shelling turned a frozen conflict into a full-scale war and changed Georgia's future forever. In August 2008, a small breakaway region called South Ossetia became the flashpoint for a direct military confrontation between Russia and a pro-Western state. What followed was not just a 5-day war, but also a warning sign that the post-Cold War order in Europe was far more fragile than the world believed. For many years before that moment, South Ossetia barely appeared in international news. It was a small land deep in the Caucasus Mountains, sparsely populated, economically poor, and seemingly insignificant in the global balance of power. Yet it is precisely places like these that history often chooses to explode. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, Georgia became an independent country. However, that independence immediately came with deep fractures. South Ossetia, where most of the population is Ossetian, refused to accept control from Tbilisi. A short but bloody war broke out. When the guns fell silent, South Ossetia existed in a state of limbo. Not internationally recognized as a country, but no longer under Georgia's effective control. This was called a frozen conflict. There was no real peace. But it was not yet hot enough to become a full-scale war. For more than a decade, the world largely forgot South Ossetia. But one country did not: Russia. For Moscow, South Ossetia was not just a small breakaway region. It was a link in the chain of strategic influence across the post-Soviet space. Russia maintained forces described as peacekeepers there. At the same time, Moscow gradually issued Russian passports to South Ossetian residents. On paper, they still lived within Georgia's territory. But legally, many of them had become Russian citizens. That was not a random decision. It was preparation. Meanwhile, on the other side, Georgia was changing. In the early 2000s, Georgia's leadership pursued a clear strategic choice, moving away from Russia's orbit and closer to the West. Joining NATO. Strengthening relations with the United States and the European Union. Escaping Moscow's historical shadow. For Georgia, this was the only path to ensure security and sovereignty. But for Russia, it was an unacceptable red line. If Georgia joined NATO, it would mean the military alliance moving right up to Russia's southern flank. And South Ossetia, once a forgotten land, suddenly became the front line of a strategic confrontation. Tensions rose steadily, step by step, day by day. Scattered clashes. Mutual accusations. Diplomatic warnings that no one truly listened to. Until that fateful summer night. The night of August 7 to August 8, 2008. In the darkness, Georgian artillery began firing on Tskhinvali, the capital of South Ossetia. Shells rained down on the small city, shattering years of silence. The Georgian government declared it an operation to restore constitutional order. But for Russia, it was a direct attack on people they considered their own citizens. Within hours, Russia's response unfolded at a speed that stunned the world. Russian tanks crossed the Roki Tunnel, the strategic route linking Russia to South Ossetia. Russian aircraft began striking deep inside Georgian territory. Military targets, bases, and airfields were hit one after another. The Russian Navy blockaded the Black Sea coast. In an instant, a local conflict turned into a war between two states. The war lasted only 5 days. But those 5 days were enough to change history. Georgian forces were quickly overwhelmed. Defensive lines collapsed. Russian troops advanced deep into Georgian territory, at times approaching the capital, Tbilisi. The world watched with bated breath. Would Russia go further? Would the war expand? In the end, Russia declared a ceasefire. The war ended as quickly as it began. But its consequences did not. The reaction of the international community exposed a harsh reality. The United States and the European Union condemned Russia's excessive use of force and affirmed that Georgia had been invaded. However, there was no direct military intervention. The reason was clear. No one was willing to confront Russia militarily over Georgia. From Moscow's perspective, the message was delivered coldly and decisively. Russia declared it had intervened to protect its citizens and to prevent a massacre in South Ossetia. Shortly after the war, Russia recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. This was not merely a political decision. It was a geopolitical declaration. The South Ossetia War of 2008 showed the world three important things. First, NATO has limits. Second, Russia is willing to use force to defend its sphere of influence. And third, the post-Cold War order was never as stable as many believed. Years later, when Crimea was annexed in 2014 and the war in Ukraine erupted in 2022, many analysts looked back at South Ossetia 2008 and said, that was the first draft. A small land. One night of shelling. But the beginning of a new era of instability. The South Ossetia conflict of 2008 was not just a short war in history textbooks. It was an early warning of the return of power politics in the 21st century, where international law, security commitments, and diplomatic promises can collapse within a few hours of a summer night. History does not always change through wars that last for decades, but through brief moments, when the world could no longer turn back.